In today's video, I want to go through how to add some animations to a video. In this particular instance, I want to do some VOX style animations, but I don't only want to show you how to actually make the animations, I also want to show you how you can add them to your video and make them feel flawless. So if you're one of the people that have been wanting to see my workflow between Davinci, Resolve, and After Effects, well, then you're in luck, because that's exactly what we're going to be doing today. But before I get ahead of myself, I just want to say a quick thank you to today's video sponsor, ASUS Pro Art. But let's hop straight into it. So in Davinci Resolve, I've just opened the program itself, which just looks like this. It should, at least for you, I haven't really changed anything. The first thing I like doing is going into this little tab down here, which is the edit page. That's just where I feel the most comfortable. And now we need to drag in our clips. And by that, I just have a couple of clips already that I've recorded today. And I just want to say that if you don't have a video yourself, then you can always get these video clips and also the project files for everything that we're going to be doing today on the Patreon at patreon.com/Mapal. Then you can follow along. Otherwise, you can always go and make your own stuff or practice with some work that you have. I have a couple clips, and normally you'd lay this out in a way that makes sense, but I just have a couple different examples that'll really help us do the animations that I also want to show. And let's start with this background animation. Drag that in, and then I always hit change just to make sure that Davinci Resolve is actually using the frame rate that I want to, and I always record in 24 frames per second, or well, technically 23.976. But then if I click this little cog icon down here, it pops up with this little screen here, and I always record in 4K because, need the juice. So I like to change it to 4K, and then I go into color management, and then I change the 3D lookup table interpolation from trilinear to tetrahedral. And essentially what that does is just gives more depth to the colors when you're using LUTs and stuff like that. So since we will be color grading it using LUTs and power grades and all that stuff, I like enabling that just because you get a little bit of a nicer grade. And then we're just gonna hit save. That's pretty much all I do for the setup itself. And then you can go in, edit however much you want. I'm just gonna zoom in a little bit, and I'm just gonna trim the start and the beginning of this. Cut here, there's some silence there. I do have a couple of shortcuts set up, which is allows me to edit a little bit faster. Once I have my project cut up the way I like it, what I like to do is go ahead and grade the clips, just because sometimes you might have a bunch of small clips and it can just be a bit tedious. So what I like to do is I like to grade it before I cut it into a whole bunch of small pieces, just because I feel like that makes my workflow a little bit easier. So I head to the color tab, and I like using power grades just because it makes it so easy. And you can see I have so many different ones, and I have one that I usually use just for regular looking stuff, and it's actually based on the Film Vision power grade. So I'm just gonna right click and then apply grade, and then it usually looks pretty decent. But then what I'm gonna go ahead and do is just in my exposure node, I'm just gonna change it because it is a little bit exposed, and I'm just gonna go in, drag the exposure down a little bit, and then just mess around until I get an image that looks pretty good. And this is not super scientific, it's just what I think looks good. And then I'm just gonna select the same clip, which is also this that I cut up. I'm just gonna right click on the one I graded and apply the grade. And that looks pretty good. And usually this works for pretty much most of them, and then I just go in and change the exposure a little bit. Speaking of grading, there's one tool that's been super essential to getting the juiciest looking footage, and that's all thanks to this video sponsor, ASUS Pro Art. Whether you do graphic design, motion design, 3D, photo, or video, I think one of the most important tools you can have is a really good display. And what I mean by that is something that's super color accurate. Because at the end of the day, all that we make is dependent on colors. I used to work off of my laptop, but the first thing I bought when I started my business and started taking this way more serious was a ASUS Pro Art monitor. I take a lot of pride in my work, so it was super important for me to have something that would help me deliver the best possible product to my clients. For this video, however, ASUS Pro Art have been kind enough to send over a beast of a monitor, and that's the PA32UC-XR, which is an incredible monitor. Not only is this sexy beast behind me huge, I mean it's 32 inches, that is large, especially coming from a 13-inch laptop. I can fit everything I need and then some, but the thing I love the most about it is how color accurate it is and also how bright it is. Now for those of you who are as nerdy and spec loving as me, let's run through some of the key points that I love about this monitor. It has 4K HDR, it has true 10-bit color accuracy, which means they can show 1.07 billion colors. Now if we compare that to my old monitor, which was only 8-bit, which only shows 16.7 million colors. It has 100% Rec. 709 coverage, 97% DCI-P3 coverage, 100% RGB coverage, and 99% Adobe sRGB coverage. All of those are super important when you're working with different mediums, like when you do photo and video, you might want to look at Rec. 709, so it's super nice to have that, but also if you do design where you might be working in sRGB or Adobe sRGB, then it's very nice to be able to switch between them and know that you're seeing accurate colors. One metric that they usually use to show how color accurate is something something is by looking at the delta E value. So in this case, for the PA32 UCXR, it's less than 1%, which is incredible. My old one, which was also super color accurate, was less than 2%. It also has a self-calibration tool. So while every single ASUS Pro monitor is calibrated from the factory individually, it's very normal for monitors to shift colors over time. Normally you would need a separate tool to recalibrate the monitor, but this bad boy has got it built in, so whenever you start seeing some color shifting, or just as a regular checkup, you can recalibrate and make sure that you're seeing the most accurate colors. This is super useful in the long run, so you can keep working on this thing for years and years and years without having to worry about the colors looking different down the line. Now, as you might be able to tell, it's super bright. It boasts a 1600 peak net brightness, which is incredible compared to my old one, which was only 350. That means it's basically like a second light. I mean, you turn it on to 100% and you've basically got another softbox right in front of you. This makes it nice and easy if you work in super bright rooms like sometimes I do with the sun coming in, or even if you are working in darker rooms and you can turn that brightness down. Unlike some basic monitors, the PA32 UCXR has a myriad of different connectivity ports. We have dual Thunderbolt 4 ports, with one of them having 90-watt power delivery, so you can keep your equipment juiced up. Or if you have multiple monitors, you can daisy chain them, which basically means you can take one monitor and connect it straight to the monitor, so you don't have to waste a port on your computer by having two different monitors. It also has two HDMI 2.0 ports, which is super nice, especially because you have picture-in-picture mode, which then lets you have, let's say, a PlayStation, for example, that you can then show at the same time as you're working. Not that it's super recommended to game while you're working, but it is definitely possible. It also has a DisplayPort 1.4 and then a regular USB hub with 3 USB Type-A ports and 1 USB Type-C port. That's a whole lot of specs, but it really comes down to how you use it. Most of the work that I do is viewed on social media, like these YouTube videos or even stuff that I post on Twitter and Instagram. And while I have my monitor set to Rec 709, I did tweak it just a little bit to be more accurate in terms of my phone. And that's simply so I don't have to worry about sending myself the file and double checking that the colors are good on cross devices. This gives me complete confidence that whatever I'm grading on the monitor is gonna look the exact same on my phone and everybody else's phones. One of the reasons why I like ASUS ProArt monitors in general is because they are tailored to creatives. So whatever you do in terms of photo, video, all that good stuff, they have something that fits your needs. And they also have so many different options for different budgets, so it just makes it super easy to start out with something like I did, which was a fairly cheap monitor, but still I could have good faith that it was really good and would show me accurate colors. Or even down the line, when you start stepping up your game, you can get something like the 32-inch, splash out and have a good time looking at some really beautiful images. Again, thank you to ASUS ProArt for sponsoring this video and for sending over this monitor. It's been an absolute blast to use, and I would highly recommend for anyone out there, get an ASUS ProArt monitor, whichever one you can afford. They are incredible and you will definitely notice a difference. Anyways, with that being said, we can now go back into the edit page and start adding some markers. And this is most of where my scrubbing back and forth work happens. Once I have everything cut up, I like to do a second pass where I add markers, or even do it while I'm watching if I have a good idea of kind of what I'm gonna be doing. And I like using just scrubbing through, and typically, just because a grade can be quite heavy, especially like the film vision one where there's halation and there's grain, it can really be quite laggy, especially in 4K. So I like to turn the color option off so that I can just see a flat image and then it plays back a lot smoother. What I'm gonna do is just zoom in, and then in specific places, like let's say right here, I'm just gonna hit M to place a marker, and then I'll usually just play back the clip and see, okay, how long do I want it to last, kind of thing. And then once I get to a point where I think that's pretty good to go, all I do is I alt-click the little icon here and just drag it out, and then that creates a segment. And this is kind of a fluid workflow. Sometimes I'll go through a whole video and do this, sometimes I'll just do it bit by bit. You can also label your markers, which is a great idea. You can just double click your marker and label this something like sign placement. I hope you're enjoying the sounds of nature, raining, you know. I mean, it is Monday after all. And then for this first one, let's do a bar graph. So now we have our segments marked out, which is going to be a lot easier for us when we then go and export everything. The way I like to do it is just click on your markers, and then you can right click and then go to set in and out from duration markers. So that just marks that exact segment that you need to export, and that makes it a lot easier than having to export the whole thing and then add it in After Effects, cut it down and all that good stuff. So I like doing this just because you end up working with smaller files, it's a bit more efficient, and you keep your timelines pretty clean. Now you can go to the Deliver tab, which is where you can export everything. I want to make it very clear that you don't have to do this exact workflow. In most instances, you might already be working with graded footage, but I really want to flex this sexy beast of a monitor, so I will obviously go this extra step and just export it in the flat profile and match it and all that good stuff. If you want to keep the grading on, then you just want to go into advanced and then go to the enable flat pass and just hit on. So essentially what that does is that even though you have a grade on the clip already, it'll export it without the grade. If you don't change this, it'll export it with the grade, and then of course you'll just be doing everything in Rec 709. As far as the render settings, if you want to flex it like we want in this case, you want to make sure that you select QuickTime for the format and then Apple ProRes for the codec, and then the type. I like doing 422 or 422 high quality HQ. And this is because in this instance, we want to be able to grade the animations as well when we bring it back. So we want as much information as possible, and that's what that codec will allow us to. If I'm just working with regular Rec 709 footage and I'm just doing it for a client, maybe they've already graded the image, what I'll do is I'll just switch the format to MP4 and then the codec to something like H.264, which is a lot easier to work with and doesn't retain as much information. But in this instance, we need the information in order to actually get what we want. Of course, you're just gonna rename your file to whatever you want. Ideally, you name it to something that actually makes sense. So like in this instance, bar graph is a good way. And then I like having a separate folder for clips that I export. So now I'm gonna export all my clips, and then we can hop straight into After Effects and start adding some saucy animations. Normally I'd hop right into the animations, but since we wanna keep that nice flat picture profile and all the color information, there is just a little bit of a setup. But if you aren't doing this setup, you can just skip straight to the animations. But if you are interested in how you can get some juicy, sexy, goosey, oosey, loosey video footage and animations, you want to follow along. First thing we're going to do is just open up our After Effects, which I have right here. And then what we're going to do is click this little icon here that says 16 BPC. Yours might say 8 BPC or 32, depending on how your After Effects is set up. Typically though, for regular animations, I just work with 16 BPC. So I'm going to click that, and that'll open up this little menu with the project settings and open us straight into the color tab. So this is what it would usually look like most of the time anyways. But what we want to do is actually change it to an ASUS workflow. So I'm going to click this color engine and switch it from Adobe Color Manage to OCIO or OCO Color Manage. And then we're going to hit OK, which is just fine. And we want to make sure that our OCO configuration is set to ASUS 1.2. From there, you want to change the bit depth to 32 because we are going to be working with a lot broader of a color spectrum. So that's just going to give us some extra color depth. Essentially, you can think of it like a gradient. So there's just going to be more steps from white to black. And then, of course, again, we want to change the 3D LUT interpolation to tetrahedral. And then in the working color space, you can do some of your own research and what works well, but I found that ASUS CC, or this one down here, works pretty well. So I'm just gonna click that and select that. In the display color space, you wanna switch it depending on what your monitor is set to. Essentially what this is it gives us an idea of what our image is going to look like, but it's not actually going to apply anything. So it's just kind of like a preview LUT on a camera if you're familiar with that. So like in my instance, for example, my monitor is set to Rec 709 because that's mainly the medium that I'm working with. So I'm going to open up this menu and switch it from ASUS sRGB to ASUS Rec 709. Now, if you are working with a monitor that's set to sRGB, then obviously you want to keep it at that. But in my instance, Rec 709 works really well. You can always turn this off so you can just look at the flat profile as well. But it's nice being able to reference how your colors are most likely going to look. And from there, we're just going to hit OK. And now our project itself is pretty much set up. Now we can take our exported clips, and I'm just going to take all of them and I'm going to drag them into my clips folder in After Effects. And this is a great way to stay organized, create these folders for yourself. The folder structure is on my Patreon as well, so if you don't want to make them every time, I have a preset project that you can use, and I even show how you can set that up on the Patreon as well. Now you might think it's as easy as just dragging the clip in and creating a new composition, but it's not. We need just a little bit more setup first. So we're going to right click on a clip, and then we're going to go to Interpret Footage and go to Main. From here, we want to go to the Color tab. We want to change the media color space to what we actually recorded with in camera. So for me, I use the Sony camera, and this is also another step where you kind of need to know. So if you're working with someone, you can always ask them if you don't have access to the camera, don't know exactly what you have, if you want to do this workflow. But for me, I know exactly what I use. I use a Sony camera. So I'm going to scroll down, and if you don't see all this, you'll just want to check all this to get all the options that's there. And I know that I filmed in Sony S-Log3, S-Gamut 3 Cine, so this input profile right here. So I'm just going to select that, and then I'm gonna hit OK. Now, instead of having to do that for every single clip, if you have a lot of the same clips from the same camera, you can go to the one you just changed, right click, go to Interpret Footage, and then Remember Interpretation, and then select all the other clips, which in this case is everything but the screen recording, because that was in a different color space. then I can right click, interpret footage, and apply interpretation. For the screen recording, we obviously didn't record that in log since that was just recorded on my screen. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go right click, interpret footage, go to main, and then I'm gonna change the color space of that. So in this instance, I'm gonna pick something like sRGB, which is most likely what this was recorded in. So I'm gonna go down and I'm gonna select sRGB right here, and then I'm gonna hit OK. Now we can actually go in and start working on the animations themselves. I want to start with the bar graph because it uses some fun techniques that I think are really fun and good to start out with. So this first animation, I'm just going to click and drag this down to the composition, and that'll then bring us this. And you can see it looks like it's been graded with just to a Rec 709 conversion because of this little tab down here, you can see. And that's also what we selected in the beginning. If we just want to see the flat image, we can just set that to none. And then it looks exactly like how it did when we exported it all straight out of camera. This is where the display color space comes into place. It just lets you see the colors somewhat accurately if you were to just throw a conversion on there. The first thing that I want to do with this clip is roto myself out. And in this instance, I'm just going to set this to none. I'm going to start by duplicating the footage, and I'm just going to hide this background because we don't really need it. And then I'm going to go to the roto brush tool. Let's just double click in here so we can actually roto it. So now I'm just going to draw a little bit of a outline, but I think that looks pretty good. You can kind of sense it a little bit here. Once the roto brush tool has done its job, you can hit freeze, which will then go in every single frame and then lock it in so that it doesn't change too much back and forth whenever you change things, and it just makes it a little bit easier to play back since everything has been stored and saved, so you don't have to recalculate the roto brush. Now that's done, I can go back into my composition and we can see we have a nice little cutout of me here that looks super clean. It's done a really good job of it, especially since just a pretty simple background to work with, some nice separation. But what that means now is I can go in, and all I want to do here is I want to create a white background behind me completely. And the easiest way to do that is just go into my original layer. I'm going to hit G to bring up my shape tool. I'm just going to crop out this little white area that we have right here. And with this layer selected, I'm going to go up to window, and then I'm going to go to content aware fill, which will open this little pop-up. All we want to do here is go to any frame pretty well. It's going to do a great job. I'm just going to go to the first frame, and then I'm going to hit generate layer. This essentially works like content aware fill in Photoshop, except it does it for every single frame. It can take a little bit of time, but I feel like sometimes it's a bit nicer than just using AI generative fill, especially because even if the camera is moving, it'll do a really good job of tracking that movement and keeping that background really nice. Now that our content aware fill is done, we can now play it back, and you can see it just creates a little layer with a bunch of single frames, and it looks super seamless, which is why I love using this tool. This is pretty much all that we're going to be doing for this little bit. So all that we got to add now is our animation, which in this case I want to be a little bit of a bar graph. You can design it in something like Illustrator, but I'm just going to do it in After Effects since I want it to be pretty simple. All I'm going to do is take my pen tool, you can always hit G, and I'm going to remove the fill at first, and then I'm going to add a stroke. In this case, I just want to set it to black, and you can also see that when you do work in the ASUS workflow, it does change this a little bit, but it's not too hard to figure out in terms of what the colors are and all that stuff. But I'm just gonna set it to black for now. I'm just gonna click and hold shift while I click another point to create a perfectly straight line. And I'm just gonna use the anchor point mover tool, or you can even use the motion tool as one. I'm just make sure that my anchor point is centered up in this, and then I'm just gonna make sure that it is in the center of my screen, and that'll then be our baseline. We can increase it a little bit if you want to. I don't want anything that's too big, but let's just add it like that. I think that looks pretty good. And then what we're gonna do is add the bars themselves. So I'm gonna hit G again, and then I'm just gonna click up here somewhere and then hold shift while I click down. And the reason why I start from the top is to make sure that it doesn't connect to this itself. And then I'm just gonna increase the width of this to create a bar looking thing. And I wanna make sure that has good ground contact. And then we can change the color of it. In this case, I might want a nice bluish color. Maybe something like that, I think looks pretty good. And then I'm just gonna drag this layer and put it behind my little shape layer so that we don't have some weird overlay. Then I can just make sure, then I just wanna make sure that my anchor point is centered again. And then I'm just gonna duplicate this and I'm gonna move it over next to it. And then while this layer is selected, I'm just gonna search for path over here. And then I can just shift click and then click again just to deselect and then reselect it, and then just take this, move it over a little bit, and then just take both of these and center them up with my shape itself. You can always hit Option and apostrophe to look at your grid and just make sure that it is nice and evenly distributed. And you can always recenter the anchor point of the second one. Now we are gonna add a little bit of text to it, and I don't wanna do anything too fancy. I wanna keep it very, very simple. I'm just gonna select my text tool up here. I'm just gonna click over something, and let's just do 2018 for this one. And let's just decrease the size of this text a little bit over here in the properties panel. I'm just gonna decrease that, and I'm gonna put it over at the bottom of this. And as you can see, because I have snapping enabled up here, it snaps neatly to the center. And I could duplicate this by hitting Command D, hold Shift and drag over, and then we can rename this by double clicking this layer and just name it 2020. Now I just want to I think I just want to change the color of this to be a white. I'm just going to set it to F3, 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 which is the typical white color that I use. And I might even want to change some of the parameters or the look of it a little bit. So I would actually like it to be just a little bit wider, and I also want to narrow it down a little bit. So I'm just going to open up my properties, go to stroke, and let's change the line cap to a round cap. And that'll just give it a nice rounded edge to make it look a little bit more elegant, in my opinion anyways. And then if we click on the layer, we can always search for path. And let's just take this, I'm gonna shift click to deselect, and then just click again, move it in a little bit, and then make sure I click the layer itself, make sure my anchor point is centered, and then just center that bad boy up. So now we have a neat little looking graph, super simple. And now we can add some animations to it. So for our text that I want to start with, I'm just going to select them both and hit P to bring up the position. And I'm just going to go forward a little bit. Let's actually hit Command K, because you can see with the clips that we imported, it actually keeps the time code of where it was in our timeline in Davinci. But for me, it makes it a little bit annoying to work with. So what I like to do is hit Command K and just set the start time code to 0. And that'll just make it a little bit easier to see the timing of everything, especially because we do have the markers in Davinci so we know exactly where we need to position the clips. Otherwise, this is a great tool. We will keyframe the position, go back about 12 frames, go down a little bit, just a nice little in animation, select them both, and then we are going to use a flow preset that I have. We're just going to do the super sexy in, and you can get these on the Patreon as well. And now if we play that back, we just have a nice simple little in animation. And as per usual, I like staggering them just a little bit, so I'm just going to drag this first one out a couple of frames, and that just gives us a little bit more visual interest, as I like to call it. Now we can take this baseline, let's just rename that by hitting enter and just name this baseline. And we're going to open this up and we're going to add a trim paths. So really nothing fancy is going on here. I'm just going to go forward, let's do 1.5 seconds, keyframe both the end and the start, go back about 12 frames, and just set both to 50. This way it animates from the center instead of from one side or the other, and I just think that's a nice way to get a line like that moving in. And you can add any type of easing. In this case, I'm just going to use sexy speed just to give us a nice little bit of movement. I might even drag the spacing out a little bit more and then move that to the very beginning. And let's take all these layers and just move them up a little bit and then drag these two forward a little bit so that we get a nice little bit of staggering movement right there. Now we can go with the graphs itself. So we're just going to name this 2020 graph, and then we are again going to add a trim paths, same as before, but we are going to change the animation of it just slightly. Opening up the trim paths, we are going to animate the start since we created the points the opposite way. So 0 will be 100% technically. So I'm just going to keyframe the start at, let's say, 1 second. Just keyframe that, and then go to the very beginning and just set that to 100%. And then you can add any type of easing. In this case, again, I'm just going to add sexy speed because it is sexy. And the good thing about trim paths is that we can simply select the keyframe and the trim paths name itself, Command C, and then paste it onto our second one. Let's rename that to 2018 graph. And now if I hit U twice to bring up all my keyframes, you can see everything animates in. So now we just need to position these so that they don't come in before our text is actually shown. So I'm just going to drag these up. Boom, right there. I think it would work pretty well. And now we have a nice little bit of animation right there. It's really that simple, but that's not all that we're going to be doing to it because we want to spice it up just a little bit. The whole point of it is to make it feel like it's a part of the scene. So I'm going to hit U to hide all my keyframes. I'm going to select all my layers and I'm just going to pre-comp them. Project settings. I just want to make sure that we stay nice and organized. So my bar graph can go into the main and graph pre can behind the screen. The cutout looks pretty good. And I want to actually enable the continuously rasterize function pixelated. So now we can scale it up and maybe move it out to the side just a little bit over here. And we'll also put the fill behind here because we don't need it to be on top actually. So this is pretty good. Might even move it over just a little bit more so that the information is clearly readable. And then we're gonna add a little bit of camera movement. So we have this coming in right here, and it's all pretty nice and smooth. I might even move it up just a little bit more to give us some time to work with. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add an adjustment layer, and then I'm gonna add a transform effect to this. And all I wanna do is keyframe the position and the scale. And then we wanna go forward a little bit. Let's hit U so I can actually see my keyframes. And then let's scale in a little bit. And then we can just push it over and push it down a little bit like that. So, and then we can add some easing to this. Let's just add a sexy speed and move this over just a little bit. And just like that, we have a nice little bit of movement. We might even adjust this a little bit to make it look a little bit nicer. And for this, I'm just gonna decrease the scale of this and move it down a little bit so we can see it super, super nicely. We can always go into our pre-comp and let's just make sure that we can actually see what we're doing. And we can just add a couple of deep glow effects, like deep glow to the text, just to add a little bit of extra spice. I like setting it to the radius to something like 800 and exposure to something like 0.3, just to make sure that it's pretty faint without being too faint. So just a nice medium of it looking pretty clean. And we can add that to the baseline as well. You can even add that to the graphs themselves. I think I might actually want to add a gradient to the graph. So I'm going to click the stroke and I'm going to change it from a solid fill to a stroke fill, or gradient fill, I should say. And I'm just going to take these pointers and move them over. And let's change the color of it just a little bit. So I'm going to click here and let's pick some nice blues colors. I'm going to select a real light one for the top and then a darker blue for the bottom to give us a nice gradual feel here. And once we've done that, we can just click our second shape layer and change it from a fill stroke to just a gradient stroke, and the color should apply. And if we just click this and then hit enter, we should get the little points right here, and we can just drag them out to fit the shape of what we actually have. And if you want, you can take the deep glow effect again, copy that and paste it on to the bar graphs themselves for just a little bit of extra flair. That is pretty much it for this little bit of animation. You have a nice little seamless looking piece of animation here. And once we finish designing all our assets, we can then export them and take them into Davinci and then color grade them again, so it really looks like it belongs. Now the second animation I want to show you is a design heavy lower third. This one is something I think is super fun, and it is a super nice way to spice up your animations. You know, it can be pretty boring if you just use the same type of lower thirds every single time. So for that, I'm just gonna take my clip in here and I'm just gonna drag it into a composition to create a new one. Let's zoom in a little bit, just set that to fit, and just make sure that my lower third comp is in the main folders. So this is just a pretty simple clip, nothing too fancy going on. As we see, it's just me pretending to say something profound. But we want to create a nice lower third that fits well within this scene, and this is where the design element comes in. So I don't want it to just be something stagnant and boring, but what we do need to start with is my name. So let's type in Mapal. You can always do a last name, so I'm just going to put in my last name here, and I'm just going to make sure that this text is center aligned right here in the paragraph. And we can actually close this content aware fill for now. So I'm just closing that so I can see this a little bit better. I'm just going to scale that up and make sure that it is nice and centered. In this instance, I do want to use the Helvetica font just because it's nice, it's on brand for me, and I just think it fits the style well. But I do want to change the color of it. So I'm just going to set it to almost black, and then let's add a little bit of a white background here. So I'm just going to click and drag to create a little shape around it, and I'm going to remove the stroke, and then I am going to add a fill, and again I'm just going to set it to F3, which is my go-to white color, and I'm just going to drag that behind. So I just want to make sure that the spacing looks good both at the top and the bottom, and also on the left and right side. So I might just increase the width of it a little bit and just make sure that my anchor point is centered up and that it is centered as well, so it's nice and clean looking. Now I found a couple of assets online. They are all like open access, so you can use them for whatever you want. They will also be available if you are on Patreon and get this project file. It'll all be there, but just a couple of different things that I think would fit well. And basically what it is it's just a couple of like flower elements to match the scenery, which is something I think is super important when you are doing this style, is you want it to make sense. So we're gonna add some photos and we're also gonna add some colors. But first I wanna add a couple of shapes that's gonna dictate the layout of everything. So I think adding another shape would be pretty nice. So let's add one down here below that kind of goes out a little bit, and we can use this as like almost like a occupation type of box. I'm just going to change the color of it to something that's a little bit more distinct so that we can actually tell it apart. And just want to make this just a little bit bigger and move it over a little bit. Might even make sure that it's a little bit extended. Let's add another shape, and this one we'll do a skinny, long one right here. Just make sure that is lined up pretty good with that, and again change the color of it to something a little bit different. Let's just go with a blue for now, and I'm just gonna take this and I'm gonna duplicate it, and I'm just gonna shrink this down to fit at the end of this, and then change the color of it to a bit of a darker color right there. And already I think we're getting somewhere. Let's add another shape element here. This one is going to be pretty big, and we're just going to add this behind type of thing. Drag this all the way behind, maybe a little bit smaller like that, and take these two and move them out just a little bit more, and then change the color of this. Maybe we'll set that to a green or something for now, just so we can get a good sense of how all our elements are coming together. And I think this is pretty good for it. I think the only last thing I want to add is just moving these out a little bit more to give it a little bit more space to actually see what this image is going to be, because that will be an image. And then maybe even adding another shape element up here that will then just connect these two and shrink that down maybe. Actually, I think that might be a little bit too much. I think this is pretty good. Gives it a nice little focus down towards the corner of it. I'm gonna take my text, I'm gonna duplicate this, and I'm just gonna name this YouTube sensation. Actually, top 5 handsome is what we are gonna say my occupation is. You know, don't wanna lie to the people. Definitely not a YouTube sensation, but this is way more believable. And this time, I'm actually gonna set it to be right aligned, and then I'm just gonna move it all the way out here, and boom. And then we can just leave the color black for now, because we'll probably change this to also be a white, but with a little bit of texture. So let's start adding some flavor to this, because right now it's pretty boring. First thing I want to do is just adding the animations to it, which is going to make it a lot easier for us to actually add the textures later on, and the pictures and all that stuff, if we get the animations down first. For all these boxes, what I actually find to be the easiest to manipulate them, instead of working with the shapes, is actually turning them into a path. So if you go into the content, open up the rectangle path, you can right click it and then convert to a Bezier path, and then that'll just let it be a little bit easier to manipulate, because you have the individual points everywhere, which is just a lot easier than working with the shape and scale and all that stuff. So I just want to do that for everything actually. So I'm just going to deselect it all and search for rectangle path like that. And then I'm just going to open that up. I'm just going to right click and convert to Bezier path for all of these. And that is pretty good. So now what I can do is just search for path, and then I'll get all of it. Super nice and simple. So let's take this main circle, for example, and we're just going to go forward to, well, first I'm going to hit Command K and just set that to 0. And then we're going to go forward to about 12 frames just to keep it nice and snappy. And we're going to keyframe that, and let's just go back to the beginning. And then I'm going to shift click to deselect, then I'm going to click and hold shift, select this one. And then I'm just going to drag this out to the very beginning. So now it's just a little bit of like a swipe in. And then and that's pretty much the concept for most of them, but some of them we are going to add just a little bit of position to as well. Next up, let's take this top 5 thing and just click the path, keyframe that at 12 frames as well, go up. And in this instance, actually let's do the same motion, but for this one we'll also add a position animation. So we get this sweep in, but I'm also going to hit Shift P on this, or I'm going to hit U and Shift P to open up the position, and then keyframe the position at the end. And I'm just going to move it over to the left a little bit, so that it actually swipes in a little bit more. Just gives it an extra layer of movement. And I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna search for path so that we can keep playing with all of this. And over here, I want it to make a little bit more interesting. So maybe this one, let's take it and then move it from top down. So at 12 frames, keyframe that, go to the beginning and shift click to deselect one, and then click it again. And I'm just gonna take these, drag it up, and that comes down. And then maybe this little one, we can take it, and let's keyframe that, go to the very beginning, and all I want to do here is go the opposite way. So in this case, I'm going to go from right to left, and then the big one, we can go from down and up. I'm just going to keyframe that, move the keyframe over to 12 frames, and let's just make sure that it is going from down to up. So now if I go to fit and play it all back, we can see we have a bunch of different movements. And I'm going to hit U to bring up all my keyframes. And let's add just a little bit more movement to these. So this little one is the main one I want to add some movement to. I'm just going to hit Shift P to bring up the position, keyframe the position, and then move that over, and then go and just move it out to the right a little bit as like a counter movement to the pink one that we have at the bottom. Select all the keyframes and let's add a flow. Let's start with the super sexy in to give it some nice instantaneous movement. Usually feels really nice, and then we can start extending these a little bit and staggering them. So I'm just going to drag them out a little bit to space them out a little bit more, and then we of course want this main one to come in first, and let's just rename these. Then we want those to come in pretty soon. I do want to offset them just a little bit though, so the title box can come in a little bit after, just to give a nice little layered movement. And the same for this up here. So if I take the green and let's start with it, and then have the little blue and the big blue come in a little bit later, kind of just stagger them a little bit randomly to spice that up a little bit. And we might even take this green one, just extend it a little bit more like that. Take all of them and just move them a little bit away so that we have a little bit of non-motion at the beginning, and then it all comes in. Now what we're going to do to reveal the name, I obviously don't want it to just be there the whole time, so I'm going to take the pick whip for the track matte, and I'm just going to track matte it to the name box, and of course make sure that the name box is still visible, so that now it reveals it like a sweeping little. And the same with the title box and the title, just make sure to re-visible it, and just like that we have a nice little bit of animation right there. Super simple, lower third. Now we can start adding our pictures. So for this first one, let's just drag in this first picture. Again, want to make sure when we drag something in, let's put it into assets, because that's what it is. And then in the assets, we want to right click, interpret footage, go to main, and then instances like this where you're not too sure and it's something that you've downloaded from the internet, it's most likely sRGB or something along that. So I'm just going to set that to sRGB, and that should be pretty good. We can always turn it on to Rec 709 and see if the colors look pretty good. Then we can take this, scale it down a little bit, and I want this to be in our green one over here. And I actually want to flip it so that the detailing is on the right hand side. So I'm going to unlink the scale, and then I'm going to set this first parameter to a negative value instead. We're just going to flip it or mirror it. And then we can take it and we're just going to track matte it again to the right shape layer, which is this one at the bottom. And then we can position it however we want and just drag that to be right underneath so that they are together. You can always re-show this if you need to, but it's not really necessary. And now we can take the other elements like this one, which I want to be a white as well. So I'm just going to click the fill, set to F3, 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 but I want to add a little bit of texture to it. To this box, I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm just going to add a grid effect. And then I'm going to take the track matte and just link it to the title box, and then we can change the color of it to be something a little bit different, maybe a bluish color to kind of look like ruled graph paper, a little bit desaturated maybe. And then we can just change this to a width slider so that we get a nice perfect grid. Scale that up, make it a little bit more faint so it's not super out there, but I think that looks pretty good. And now you can see we have a nice little grid effect right there, which just adds a little bit more detailing to it. But for this main one, we can add a little bit of like a fake shadow type thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to over here, that's just going to act as my shadow type thing, and I want to place it above my name box, and I want to use a pick whip track matte, of course. And what I want to do here is then change the color to, let's do a darkish color. I'm going to add a fast box blur, and I'm going to increase that a good bit. And then we are going to add a roughen edges, and that'll then take that and we can make it into like a noise texture type thing. So increase the complexity a good bit so we get some nice crazy looking stuff. And the border you want to play around with so you get some that's pretty wild. You want to decrease the scale a whole bunch, increase the edge sharpness, change the color of this to be not as crazy, and then we just have a nice little bit of detail element. And then we can go into the name box again, and I'm just going to change this to a gradient fill, and then I'm just going to set this to be over at the top over here and take a little bit of gradient from the bottom. And we will of course change this to actually be colors we can see. So I'm just going to increase the opacity of this one, change this color to F3, 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 and then this one we're going to set it to F3, 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 but just take the slider down a little bit to give it a bit of a gradient. And then we just want to play around with this to make sure that we get a nice bit of gradient in there. Let's take this second flower and let's just drag that in there. And again, we want to make sure that we do the same type of thing that we did before. So I'm just going to drag it into assets. And this time I'm just going to select the first one that we did, right click, interpret footage, go to remember interpretation, right click this one, and then interpret footage and apply interpretation. So now if you change this to Rec 709 again, it'll look normal. Then we are just gonna scale this down a little bit, and let's just make sure that we actually link it to what we want. So in this instance, I wanna link it to this blue. So I'm just gonna take this picture, track mat it to the blue, put that over here. You can reshow that so you know exactly where you are. Take that and let's just scale this down a good bit. Rotate it 90 degrees and move it down so we have a little bit of the stem here. Scale it up just a little bit more like that, and then change the color of this to maybe a nice greenish color to fit our theme. And that is pretty much it for the lower third. So now we have all of this animated pretty well. And what we can do is just add a posterized time to this, which is nice and easy. Set that to 12 because we are working with 24 frames per second, so we just want to half that. Now, before we forget, there is one thing that I want to do in this composition before we are done with it. See, with us using the shape layers, they won't actually export out in the way that we wanted to because of how it works. I don't know the technicalities of it, but what I've found works is if you select the shape layer, let's take our name box for example, we will be applying this to all of them. We're gonna open up FX Console, but you can also, I would recommend getting this, but you can find it wherever you want. And we're gonna add a OCO color space transform. And in this, we wanna essentially take this from sRGB to slog3 right here, which is gonna make it a lot easier. So we're gonna find the sRGB one, boom, and then you can see the colors will change and we'll set the output color space. And in this case, I'm just gonna set it to slog3 because that is what our clip is as well. It's just gonna make it a little bit easier. So sgamut 3, cine, slog3. You can see the colors change and we'll copy that and then we'll apply it to the other shape layers as well. And you can see it all changes relatively. So once we add the gray to it, it'll look basically how we want it to, but with the grade that we also want it to. So that is pretty much it. Now the next thing I want to look at is a screen recording. And in this instance, I have this little clip here. I'm just gonna drag it in. Same as per usual, drag it in, make sure the comp is in the right place. And it just has this very, very simple screen recording. But what I want to do to it is add a little bit of texture, a little bit of spice, just to make it look a little bit more interesting. Of course, I've already gone ahead and found it, and I'm just using a texture from Texture Labs that should work pretty well, and I'm just gonna drag that into textures because, well, it is a texture. I'm gonna start by scaling it down a whole bunch. And again, right click on it, go to interpret footage and apply interpretation, since we already have that set up for the sRGB space that we just copied just a second ago. And now we can play around with the blending modes to get something that looks pretty good. And I'm just doing that by holding shift and hit minus or plus to cycle through them until we find one that fits pretty well. I think hard light looks pretty good. Let's try decreasing the opacity just a little bit, just so we get a little bit of that texture in there. And for this one, I might even set it to Rec 709 just so we can get a good sense of how that looks. We might even play around a little bit more just to make sure that we actually do have the best looking one out there. I think actually maybe even darker color might be pretty sick. I feel that gives us a pretty good look. So that right there is pretty good for the main texture itself, but that's not quite all that I want to do to it. So I'm going to add an adjustment layer and I'm going to add an optics compensation, which will just let us get a little bit of distortion on the edges. I'm just going to increase that a good bit, and then I'm just going to reverse the lens distortion so that it's zooming out towards you. Just gives it a little bit more focus. You can see how it affects the texture here as well by giving it a little bit of bending. And then I'm going to take a shape layer up here. I'm going to make sure that it's an ellipse, and I'm going to change the color to a black. I'm just going to double click the shape tool up here, which is going to give us a nice perfectly sized kind of vignette type of thing. And I'm going to add a fast box blur to this. I'm going to increase it a good bit so you get some nice smooth feathering up there. And then we are going to add a solid composite, which will just give us that white. And then we can just hide this and add another adjustment layer above the screen recording. And in this instance, we are going to add a camera lens blur, which will just give us the ability to use that blur map to actually drive the settings here. So I'm just going to select my shape layer that we've created, effects and masks, and then if we zoom in and then increase the blur radius to something like 15, and if I then hit invert, should be able to see that now it blurs out the black. We don't want to keep it on that, but this kind of depends on the look that you're going for. You can place it above the texture, but then it'll obviously take away a bit of that texture like you see down here. So just keep that in mind, that sometimes that is a little bit of not necessarily artifacting, but it's just kind of a side effect of the effect. And I'm just going to go into the ellipse, and I'm just going to scale this down a little bit to create a little bit more focus on our main area right here, and maybe even a little bit more. I'm just going to show this so I can actually see exactly what I'm doing. Scale that in, get a nice little really focused and dialed in look on this. And what I'm gonna do to hide a little bit of this ugly texture is I'm just gonna add an adjustment layer, and I'm just gonna add a vignette. And it's not necessarily that the texture is ugly, but it's just very hard to see when you blur it that much to create a little bit of that focus. And again, the vignette also helps dragging in that focus into it a little bit as well, which also helps. Now, the next thing I'm gonna do to add a little bit of animation, and I think this typically works best for these type of animations where it's supposed to look like a screen. I actually want to move the texture and the screen recording at the same time. So I'm gonna right click down here, go to new null object, and I'm just gonna drag it right below all my adjustment layers. I'm just select my two layers, which is my texture and then my screen recording, and I'm gonna parent them to my null layer. And that's just gonna let me move that or move them together so it actually looks like we're panning across the screen so the texture is not just still. In this instance, I'm just gonna disable all my adjustment layers and all that stuff to make it a little bit easier for me, less render intensive. I'm gonna hit P and S, Shift S, to open up my parameters. And right here, when the mouse starts coming in, all that I want to do is add a little bit of animation to it. So I'm going to keyframe all of this, go forward a little bit, and then I'm going to scale in, and let's just move that out this way, maybe in a little bit more. So now if I take these keyframes and add a bit of sexy speed to them, we should get a nice little bit of movement here where we kind of zoom in and you can see the texture follows with the screen, which just adds another layer of detail and makes it feel a little bit more realistic rather than just having the texture be stagnant. Once I start typing here, I actually want to do a little bit of a sort of a match cut. So right here, for example, let's cut these layers. I'm just going to U to hide all of that. So I'm just going to cut all of that and place them above so we know what's what. And then I'm going to select both my nulls and I'm just going to hit U because it'll bring up all these settings. I'm going to delete these because I don't need them right here. But what I will do is just keyframe the scale and the position right here, and I'll go forward and keyframe the scale and position right here. And then in this one, which is the first one, I'm gonna zoom in a little bit. I'm gonna scale it up a little bit and move it out a little bit and move it up a little bit so that we get close to this center line. And for this one, I just need a little bit of movement right here, boom. But then for this one, I want to add a lot more movement. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get it to exactly where I want it. So I'm going to zoom in a whole bunch, move it up to my center line, right about there, and then move that over to be a little bit closer to center so it feels not as weighted to one side and kind of lets me easily focus on the text that's being written. And then I just want to line all of these keyframes up with one another, like that, and then just make sure they are pretty much centered. Select them all and then select the Sexy Speed plugin. Can get it on Patreon. Now if you play that back, you get a nice little bit of a match cut where you don't get all the movement in one go, which I think works pretty well in most cases. Is it just gives it a little bit more, I think, just visual interest. But then we can enable our adjustment layers again like such, and let's add another little bit of detail in there. We're gonna add another adjustment layer. Let's add a transform effect, and we're gonna set the scale to 102, and then we are gonna alt click the position, which is gonna let us write an expression down here. I'm just gonna set post-rise time 3, and then a wiggle expression. I'm gonna set it to 222 by 2, or comma 2, and that'll just give it a little bit of a shake. And then I'm gonna hit U and make another adjustment layer and add a post-rise time. As per usual, just spices it up a little bit. And now if we play this back, we get a nice clean looking animation, and it just adds a different layer of depth to your screen recordings, makes them look a little bit more interesting, gives them some character. That is pretty much it for this specific effect. So now we can hop on to the next effect, which is gonna be a little 3D space text type of thing. Combine that with footage. Going back into my project settings, we're gonna take the text in front and drag it in and create a composition based on this. I'm gonna hit Command K, and then I am gonna take this and just set that to 0 again with the time code, boom. So we have something nice and easy to work with. I'm just gonna set that to none for now. All I wanna do here is fake some 3D space actually, and put some text in front. And this is super, super simple, but a super clean effect that just lets you just add a little bit of spice. So all I'm gonna do here is add some text, and we'll put that over here, and then I'm gonna duplicate this and put that over here. Then I wanna add a little bit of detail elements to this. I'm just gonna hit G, and then we're gonna create some fake brush strokes type thing. And all I wanna do here is just click and drag, and I don't need it to be super straight. I'm gonna remove the fill from this and then just enable a stroke, and let's do maybe a yellowish color would work well, like an orangey yellowish color would work well for this type of thing. Then we are gonna add a roughen edges to this to create that nice brush look. And let's just increase the complexity just a little bit, increase the border a little bit more, and then we're gonna increase the scale a little bit, and then we're gonna stretch it a good bit. Might increase the complexity a little bit more and the scale too until we get something that is nice and we get some nice texture in there. That's mainly what I'm going for. Play around with the edge sharpness, don't want it to be too sharp, but I think that looks pretty good for a nice little brush stroke look. We're just gonna place that behind, duplicate it, and let's just move that over to our other side. Let's just move this around a little bit. Over here, this way is pretty good. And then we're gonna create another one, we're just gonna connect them. So I'm just gonna click right here, go up, and create a little bit of a loop-de-loop almost, and change the color of that to be a little bit different. Maybe a more yellowish yellow, and we can decrease the stroke of that a good bit, since we just want it to be like a connecting line type of thing. And let's just play around with the shape of this. And then we can take the roughen edges from the first layer and just paste it onto that. And that looks pretty good. That's a cool little stroke right there. And now we can just add some trim paths to this. Open up this first one, go to add a trim paths, go forward a little bit and just add some keyframes. So we're started at 0 and 0, go forward a little bit, set that to 100, go forward a couple frames, keyframe the start, go forward even more, and then keyframe the end to 100%. Select all those keyframes and set that to sexy speed, and that'll just give us a nice little moving stroke right here that'll just show, take our eyes, lead it onto that, and then bada bing, bada boom. And we can just take the keyframes right here that we have created, and let's just copy that and paste it onto the two other shape layers. But this time I want to start at the very beginning, so paste that in there. And if we play that back, we now have a nice little animation here. And now we just gotta make sure that we have it all lined up pretty well. So we have this first text that's gonna come in. We're just gonna add a nice little position animation to this again. Keyframe that, go to the beginning, drag it down. Just as simple as it gets, super sexy in speed. We're just gonna give it a little bit of and then we're gonna take this, let's drag that down actually, take this and move it up forward to where our line connects. So right here, we kind of want it to come in because that is where our line kind of comes to it. We can just keyframe, we can just hit P on this and just keyframe the position of this as well to a similar type of look and same type of easing. So playing that back, we now have this first text that comes in, we have a little detail element in there, then we have the line that connects the boom, boom, just as simple as that. And then we want to animate the out of this too. So right as this comes to an end, we can take this, keyframe the position, go forward a little bit and just drag it down. And then we're gonna add the super sexy out, which is the inverse of the super sexy in, go one back, and then all I'm gonna do is hit Option and close bracket. That'll then cut the layer. So now we get a nice little animation like that. Just super simple. And then we can do the same with this. So just hit P to bring up the position, keyframe that, go forward a little bit, then drag it down and go one frame back and Alt or Option and close bracket, and that'll then end our text animation. And we want to make sure that we do of course add the correct easing, otherwise it's going to look a bit funky. So to create the fake 3D, all we're really going to do is we're going to separate them into pre-comp. So we have this first layer, which is fine, we'll just leave that right there, and we can add a fast box blur to it. And then for the second one, we're just gonna pre-comp this and rename it. And then we'll just add fast box blurs to these as well. And that's just to make it pretty easy on us when we do the blur, so we can create different depths with them all. So for this first one, let's take this. Let's take all these, move them up a little bit. So we want it to come in right here and we want it to start out blurred. So I'm just gonna set the iterations to 6 to get a nicer looking blur. Set that to 6 and then increase this to something like 6 as well, which is gonna give us a nice blurry look. And then we can keyframe the blur radius. Let's just hit U so we can see that. Move it up a little bit. And then right about here, this is where we want to have it start coming into focus. So you're gonna keyframe this as well at 0. So now this, our background layer is starting at 0 and our text is starting at 6, and then we're just gonna invert them. So we're gonna take the text to 0, and then we're gonna take the background to 6. Now you wanna play around with this to get a look that you think looks pretty good, but I think 2 works pretty well for the background, just so it's not too extreme. And then once we come over here, we then want to keyframe the second layer as well, and we want to set that to 6 also. But for this, we want to start it at something a little bit more than the background, maybe like a 3, so it kind of looks like maybe it's a little bit on a different plane than the other text. And then we want to keyframe this as well, and let's just move this up just a little bit, and then go forward a little bit, and then we want to set this to 0, and let's do this one to 3, just so it's kind of, might even start this a little bit before so that we get a little bit out of focusness as this comes into play. We get a nice little focus pull, but then I also want to add a little bit of a change in focus in the background just to actually accentuate, because in the real world, everything will shift when something comes into focus. So we're going to keyframe that, go forward, and maybe just set that to 3. Just super simple. And just like that, we have a nice little animation with a nice little focus shift right there, and then a shift over to that. And then as this ends out, I then want to shift focus back before it fully leaves. So I'm going to keyframe the blur radius for this and the blur radius for the background, go forward a little bit, and just set this first one to something like 4, and then our actual video clip itself to 0. And then we can just take all of these and let's just add some sexy speed just to spice it up a little bit. And we can even drag these out just a little bit just to get make it a little bit more of a smooth motion. And just like that, you have a super nice, sexy little animation with some focus shifts. You can even spice it up a little bit more by doing some of the same techniques we did with the screen recording. You can add an adjustment layer, add a transform effect to it, which is just let you move it around a little bit. And then we're just going to keyframe the position of the scale. Let's hit U, and then move this over to where the text kind of starts to come in. And then we're going to move it right here. Let's scale that up a little bit, and then move that out right there. And then we're going to go forward to right here, keyframe these again, go to where this new text is coming in, and then just move over and maybe scale in a little bit more. Move over, and then again right here, keyframe them all, and then we'll take it right back to the original position. So just copy and paste those original keyframes and match the easing to your blur as well, so sexy speed for the movement. If you want to take it one step further and make it look like it's actually handheld, you can add another adjustment layer. Again, we'll be adding the transform effect and set the scale to something like 105, and then alt-click the position, and instead of adding a posterized time and putting the values at 222,2 for the wiggle, we're just going to do a wiggle and do something like 1,10, which is pretty subtle. And then all we're going to do here is just let it do its thing, and it's just going to give it a slight bit of motion moving around, just the tiniest bit. And it's really subtle, but it helps a lot in just creating a little bit more of an organic feel. You can especially see it out in the corners here that it just adds a little bit of movement. That's pretty much it for that effect, but we do of course want to go back into our lower third, and what we can do is just copy the Oshio color space transform right here and paste it onto our shape layers in here. So paste it onto that and paste it onto these as well, so that we do have the correct color space transform when we then color grade it in Davinci later on. With that being said, we can finally hop onto the final effect, which is going to be a sign replacement. For that though, I'm just going to drag all these into their correct folders so we can stay nice and organized. So the sign replacement, same as before, I'm going to drag it in to create a new composition, Command K, and just change the time code to 0. For the sign replacement, it's pretty much the same technique as we did with the background and extending it. We want to use the content aware fill again to remove what's on the sign, and then we can add some animations to it, switch it out, and just make it look really fun. You could also do this with a moving clip as well, but I was filming by myself, so it's kind of hard to do that. So I'm going to hit G with my layer selected so we can create some mask, and all I want to do here is pretty much just mask out the text. I want to essentially remove as little as possible from this. I'm just going to hit M and then subtract, and then I'm just going to do this for all the text here, and that'll give my content aware fill more space to work with, but it'll also keep some of those textures that we have in here from the sign that makes it look really nice. So with all of this masked out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to Window, I'm going to open the content aware fill space again, and we are going to generate a fill layer. And our content aware is done. And as you can see, it's done a really good job of just getting a nice clean plate for us that we can then add anything to. What can we add to it? Well, pretty much anything we want. We can take any picture, any text, and just add it to it. An easy way to do this, especially when you are working with something that is already steady, is actually making a little mask or in this case, just a shape. And I'm just gonna take my pen tool and I'm just gonna create a shape along this, which is gonna make it nice and easy for us to actually mask things within this. And then remove the stroke from that. Let's just change it to a fill so we can actually kind of see what it is that we're working with, and just decreasing the opacity a good bit so that we can actually see. Path definitely needs adjusted a little bit, so let's just go in and start doing some of that adjusting. And it is pretty important to get a super nice clean plate for this. The better you get it, the better it's gonna look. So any time you spend on this will pay off. It's not one of those where, you know, it's just kind of a whatever thing. So we've got a little plate here that we can always use to mask things out. So let's add a couple of things to this. So let's add some text. We'll make our own sign. That's how big and important we are. Rotate this a little bit to actually fit. And let's add just a nice little animation. We can do some presets, like a slide in of some sort. Doesn't really matter. So we got a slide in. You can see it comes out from the outside, which we don't want. And that's where our little mask will work perfectly. We'll pick with that, and now it's just inside of that. And this is where something like this workflow really shines, because we can go around and play with the blending modes and make sure that it actually looks like it belongs in there instead of just being something that's pasted on. Let's set this to overlay, something like that. Add maybe deep glow to it. Set that to 800, 0.2, something nice and sweet. Put that in there, and then right here, we can take this, let's just add a little bit of like a paint wipe effect. So we're just gonna hit G, and I'm just gonna create some zigzag lines, super simple, and we are gonna remove the fill, and then I'm gonna add a stroke, and I'm just gonna set that to black. Increase that a whole bunch, open it up, go to contents, go to shape, go to stroke, and change the cap to a round cap, and also the line join to a round join, which is just make sure everything is rounded. We can go into the text we did before, and in the shape layer, we can copy that roughen edges, and we can paste it onto this, which will just give us a little bit of that texture. Although we might want to play around with the settings just a little bit to make sure that we get something that looks pretty good for exactly what we need. I think that looks pretty good, and we can add a trim paths to this. So I'm just gonna open up, trim paths, and right about here, set that end to 0, keyframe that, go forward to about 2 seconds, so about 12 frames animation, and then that is pretty much it for that little bit. So that'll come in, it'll animate in, it'll look like a brush stroke. Let's add in a clip that I have from this video, just something nice and easy. So let's go into video, and let's go into B-roll. Let's get a nice little clip in here that is really sexy. You know, I do want to flex that I do have this super sexy monitor. Shout out again, ASUS. This thing is absolutely beautiful. Let's find, I like this clip. This could work well for a sign. So I'm gonna drag that in there, and we wanna make sure that we also change this. So I'm gonna right click, go to entire footage, main, color, and then change this to S-Log3, like we filmed it in. Again, this does make it a little bit tedious, but it is worth it. So bada bing, bada boom, and then we can track map this to the shape layer again. And then let's just scale this down a little bit, and let's just play around with the blending mode, see if there's something that looks super nice. And I might even hide this text because I don't want to be able to see that through. I just want to see it on the sign type of thing. That looks pretty good to me. And let's just take both of these actually, both the text and the video clip, and we're just gonna change the track map to our shape layer, and then we are just gonna invert it for the second one so that they change, you know? So we start with the picture, and then maybe we switch over to this little bit. So just having them the opposites, you can also do it the other way, but then we're gonna take these two and the shape layer, we're gonna pre-comp it and just name this sign pre. And then we can take it and then we can track map it to our shape layer to make sure that it is only within the sign that we're actually seeing something, just to make it nice and easy for us. Now we do want to go into our sign in here, and then we can just go back into our text or into our lower third, copy that OCS color space transform, copy that right there, and then just add that to our text here. So just add that to the text in there, boom. So that we get the right colors on that, and yeah, that's pretty much it. And that's pretty much it for the 5 different types of animations. But how do you get it into Davinci again, where you can actually color grade it the way you want to? The workflow is a little bit different than usual, and it's super important that you do it in the right steps, because otherwise there's really no point to this workflow. So let's go into the first one, for example, where we have this bar graph. And again, we want to make sure that we do have the color space transform in here as well, just to make sure that we get the actual colors that we want, just to be completely sure, and we can see it's all grayed out and all that stuff. But then what we want to do is go into composition, add to render queue, and this is the same for pretty much everything. I'm just going to quickly go through it. So the settings in here are going to be a little bit different. So render settings, best settings, that's completely fine. You want to click on the output module, and then you want to change it. So what you want to do in here is definitely select QuickTime, and then in the format options, you either want to select ProRes 422 if you're working with something that isn't transparent, and if you are working with something that's transparent, you want to use Apple ProRes 444. That's going to let you keep that transparency. So for this specific one, we're going to do 422 HQ, which is just high quality, so more settings. But we want to change the depth to trillions of colors. And then we want to go into the color tab and we want to change it to S-Log3. So everything that we're seeing right now pretty much is whatever. We want to make sure that we export it in the right settings that matches the clips. So I'm going to select show all, so everything is in there. And then I want to go down and select the camera profile that we have. So that's S-Log3, S-Gamut 3, Cine. And then we want to make sure that everything is good, all that stuff, blah, blah, blah. That looks good. Okay. And then you want to select a place you want to render it to. And then I'm just going to queue up the second one, which is going to be our lower third. Now this one is going to be a transparent background. We don't actually need the clip in there at all, because then we can just take this, place it wherever we want to. It makes it a little bit easier. So for this, we want to go to composition, add to render queue again, and then it's somewhat similar. You still want to change it to trillions of colors to keep all that good depth in there. You want to go into format options this time, and then you want to select 4444, which is going to let you export it in a transparent. And then channels, you want to make sure you also include the alpha channel, which will let you then, well, get the transparency. Again, color, go in and you want to make sure that you check show all if you don't see your options in there, and then you want to select the S-Log version in my case, boom, and then hit OK. So now that's pretty much ready to go as well. A nice thing is, instead of having to do this every single time, what you can do is you can go into edit, you can go into templates, and then you can go and create a template for output modules. This makes it a lot easier than having to redo all this every single time. So what you can do is just hit new, and then let's change it to create just a regular 422 preset. So I want to change it to trillions of colors. I want to go into format options, make sure that it's set to 422 HQ. And then in the color options, because I know the clips that I take will always be S-Log3, I'm going to hit show all. I'm going to go down and I'm going to select my S-Log3, boom, hit OK. And then we can rename this. We can name this S-Log3 output module 422, just so I know exactly what format it is. That is pretty much it. You can save these wherever you want, so you can send them to different computers and share them and all that stuff. We're just going to hit OK. And now we can go in and select a different module. So you can see I already have a good few presets right here that I've already set up, and that's pretty much it. And this is the new one that we just created right here. So that auto fills all the settings for you, so you don't have to do it every single time. But you just want to do that for all the clips, and then you just want to render them out. I've exported all my clips, and now we can start dragging them into Davinci Resolve again. This is going to be super easy. We're just going to take them and drag them in. So we have the bar graph here. Obviously, with a clip like this where you extend the background, you'd obviously want to do this with the whole thing. But in this instance, we didn't, just for the sake of use. But as you can see, pretty decent right here. And we get a nice little graph here. All we're going to do to really get it to look similar to everything else is we can just apply the color grade from this, just like that. And then if we turn on the color thing, like we turned off before, you can see we now have a nice little graded piece of animation right there. It's really that simple, and you still get the nice colors here. Again, you want to play around with this. As you can see, the text here is a bit blown out just because we did a bit too much on the glow, but that's always something you can play around with and make sure you get it really nice. But then we have something like the screen recording right here. If we drag that in right here, you can see we now have something where it looks very, very dull. But then if we go in and add a grade from one of these, so we're just gonna apply the grade right here, and let's just reset that. And then let's just play around with the contrast a little bit and increase the lights a little bit like that. We get something that looks a lot cooler than just a basic, like just the basic boring stuff. We get something with a little bit more character, a little bit more flavor, and it matches it a little bit better. And let's take in our little text in front. We can drag that in, and let's just put it right at the beginning right here. So as you can see, we have the normal color here, and then it cuts into our color graded version. So all we're gonna do here is take the color grade from the original one, right click, apply grade, and then that'll match perfectly with one another because we have the right picture profiles. So it just makes everything look like it's a little bit more a part of what we're actually making. You can see the colors fit a little bit more. But that is pretty much it for this tutorial. I just wanted to showcase this little workflow. I love using this if I'm doing animations where I also have some video, like some of these examples that we went through today. Just a nice little way to add a little bit of spice and make sure that your animations feel like they're actually a part of your video, especially if you're doing some compositing work. And when you have a monitor like the ASUS PA32 UCXR, it just makes all of that way more fun because you get to see all the colors super vibrantly and vividly, and most importantly, accurately. I just want to say thank you to ASUS for sponsoring this video and sending over this monitor. If you guys are looking for some new gear, I'd highly recommend checking out a monitor. They're super nice, super fun, and they have such a big impact on the work you do because, as I mentioned, at the end of the day, everything we do is colors. If you're interested in project files or the videos that I recorded for this specific tutorial, then you can find it on the Patreon at patreon.com/Mapal. And with that being said, I just want to say thank you. Hopefully you learned something new. Hopefully you feel inspired to go out and try some of this on your own. And I'll see you again next time. Peace out.